Just welcome everybody. It's nice. This is the third Comparative Muslim Societies talk of this semester. We've had two already, one about Islamic libraries from Spain to India, which was given by Laurent Ferry, who's the curator of rare manuscripts collection at Cornell. And we had one by Emre Yildiz about Iranian pilgrims in traffic, historicity and sociality of saint visitation across borders. And Emre Yildiz is the Crown Junior Chair in Middle Eastern Studies and Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Northwestern University in Chicago. Today, we're very lucky to have Raza Ahmed Rumi, who's the director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College and a friend of the program. He's been to a number of these over the years. And he is going to be talking about In Search of a Modern Muslim, the life and works of Sayyid Ahmad Khan, something that's a subject very near and dear to his heart. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Raza and just welcome everybody. Oh, and by the way, if I don't know you, I'm Eric Taliokotso. I'm a professor in the history department at Cornell, and also I run the Comparative Muslim Societies program. So Raza, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me formally thank the CMS program at Cornell for inviting me to speak this afternoon about Sayyid Ahmad Khan, also known as Sir Sayyid, who continues to inspire, generations. And I'm going to talk about myself. And personally speaking, I've always found his work, especially in the last decade or so, most inspirational. And basically, what Sayyid Ahmad Khan, my admiration for him has grown over the years, and that has happened due to my own engagement with his work. I grew up in Pakistan, where we are taught about Sayyid Ahmad throughout our school years as the grandfather of Muslim nationalism in 19th century India. While it is true that Sayyid Ahmad was a Muslim reformer, an activist, his appropriation by the Pakistani nation-state project has only confounded the expanse and range of his work and engagement with Muslims and non-Muslims in colonial India. A selective and carefully curated history is what we have confronted and imbibed. And more than a decade ago, while working on my first book, a memoir cum travelogue on Delhi, the capital of India, I came across the many volumes of Asar al-Sanadid, or translated as the remnant signs of ancient heroes, that painstakingly documents the monuments, places, and people of Delhi. Reading this copious work enabled me to come into direct relationship with Sayyid Ahmad's mastery over language, insights, and the breadth of his vision that was free of bigotry or prejudice that my generation has experienced in Pakistan and India. As I delved further into his writings, speeches, and by no means I have read even a fraction of all that he wrote, it was clear that Sayyid Ahmad was not only ahead of his times, but in a way also free of the geographical confines that we have imposed on the histories of the subcontinent. This is why Sayyid Ahmad is almost a forgotten figure in Indian mainstream, and like the Urdu language, only a segment of his vast life and vision have crossed over to Pakistan. I started writing this paper last year when I was commissioned by a journal to focus on reform, which, as you all know, is quite popular, especially in the West, as it struggles to address and confront the Muslim question. My paper is still a work in progress, and when Eric asked me to participate in this series, I readily accepted, as I wanted to share the great admiration of this larger-than-life figure whose work is important not just for South Asians, but Muslims across the globe. While I'm not too comfortable to indulge in reductionism, the focus of my talk will be the incredible efforts that Sayyid Ahmad made to uplift the Muslims of colonial India in the late 19th century, and why this project remains important even today. I'm also grateful to my friend and guide, Professor Yasmin Saikia, for helping me with the research as well as giving her own insights into the life of this extraordinary man. Saikia has recently co-edited the Cambridge Companion to Sayyid Ahmad Khan with Raisur Rahman, which was published last year. I will start with the brief biography of Sayyid Ahmad, followed by the context in which he lived and how he made sense of the Muslim decline after the tumultuous events of 1857. The next section will focus on his services in education and raising awareness, his almost radical views on the need to reinterpret Islamic traditions will be discussed in the third part of my talk. And finally, I will also talk a bit about his emphasis on the community, voluntary associations, and the rich legacy that he has left for us all. Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the 19th century reformer, writer, and thinker, has influenced generations for his emphasis on modern education. However, the real significance of the man, in the words of poet, philosopher Allama Iqbal, I quote, consists in the fact that he was the first Indian Muslim who felt the need of a fresh orientation of Islam and worked for it, unquote. Sayyid Ahmad was born on 17th October 1817 in Delhi, in a household with strong ties to the fading Mughal nobility. His maternal grandfather and paternal grandfather were associated with the late Mughal courts. His own father was close to Akbar Shah since the days of the latter's princehood. And as a boy, Sayyid Ahmad studied Persian, Arabic, mathematics, medicine, along, of course, with the Holy Quran. In 1837, he joined the service of the English East India Company, starting as a munshi and then rising to the rank of subordinate judge. In 1867, he was posted as the judge of the Small Causes Court. Later, he was nominated to the Viceroy's Legislative Council in 1878. During the later period of his government career, Sayyid Ahmad established Gulshan School at Moradabad in 1859, Victoria School in 1863, and the Scientific Society in Aligarh in 1860s. In 1867, Sayyid Ahmad started the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental School in Aligarh, a small town in North India, and Sayyid's work has placed now Aligarh on the map, the intellectual map of Indian subcontinent. He also got the opportunity to visit England in 1869 and 70. Upon his return, he decided to create the MAO High School on the pattern of British boarding schools. The school later turned into a college in 1875, and in 1920, it became a university. His writings, which are just a long list, an endless list, include, among the others, a most important eyewitness account of the Indian uprisings of 1857, known as the War of Independence as well, and it's called the Risala Isbab-e Baghawat-e-Hind. And it is therefore important to trace the context in which Sayyid Ahmad lived and worked. During a century, 1757 to 1857, the Muslim power dwindled as the British expanded their influence and continued to annex territories in India. During the 1857 War of Independence, also known as the Mutiny by some historians and the colonial accounts, the Muslims were recognized as a major threat by the colonial power, and in decades to come, the Muslims lost much of their influence after centuries of enjoying power in medieval India. And for many years, the Muslim societies around the world, since the 18th century actually, had felt the need for a renewal or tajdeed. The rules by which communities organize themselves had changed drastically since the scientific and industrial revolution, and the need for Islam and the Muslim way of life to adapt to the new realities was becoming unavoidable. In such a transformational milieu, Islamic reform that was defined was both in opposition to Western cultural and political hegemony, while also making use of the Western knowledge and technologies as needed. Sayyid Ahmad Khan was the first to realize the urgency of this reform in India, as well as the one who had the most profound and lasting effect on it. The reformism project of Sayyid Ahmad Khan can be summarized in a few points, and I'm grateful to Frances Robinson's work, her paper entitled Islamic Reform and Modernities in South Asia. And in a summary, in a nutshell, it was first this reformism project entailed ending the total authority of the past as Muslims sought new ways of making revelation and tradition relevant to the present. Second, bringing human will to the center. as Muslims had realized that in a world without political power, it was only through their will that an Islamic society could be created on earth. Third, stressing the need for the transformation of the self, which can be accomplished through willed activity in order to achieve self-reflectiveness, self-affirmation. And finally, moving from the scripturalism to rationalization. And Robinson also says of entering into a process of secularization. So I come back to the decade of 1850s, which had a profound impact on Sayyid Ahmad Khan. He was greatly agitated by the treatment that the Muslims received following the War of Independence. You know, the Mughal king Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled. You know, his sons were executed, and I mean, there are tales which are horrific of that particular time. And Sayyid Ahmad Khan's own house had come under attack during that tumultuous time. I quote him, post-Ghadar, which is revolt, I was not disappointed by looting of my house and loss of belongings. I was disturbed due to the ruination of my qaum, which is the community, he said. Heartbroken, he first decided to leave the country, but then changed his mind. And I quote in his own words, I gave up the idea of migration and decided to struggle for the rebuilding of the qaum, unquote. Indian Muslims, unlike their Hindu counterparts, had shied away from Western education. In fact, by being apathetic and in some instances totally antagonistic towards the language of the British rulers, Sayyid Ahmad Khan urged that the Indian Muslims were only hurting themselves. As historian K.K. Aziz noted, and I quote, the Muslims did not take to English language and thus denied themselves opportunities of material as well as intellectual progress. Material because government jobs were open only to English-knowing persons, unquote. Sayyid Ahmad Khan urged his co-religionists to learn the language of the rulers. He believed that by failing to learn the English language, the Indian Muslims, quote unquote, self-excluded themselves from the mainstream society and politics of the subcontinent. In Stephen Hay, quoted by Belmeki in a very important paper called Sayyid Ahmad Khan's Framework for the Educational Uplift of the Indian Muslims during British Raj, has quoted Sayyid Ahmad Khan addressing Muslims as saying, I quote, if Muslims do not take to the system of education introduced by the British, they will not only remain a backward community, but will sink lower and lower until there will be no hope of recovery left to them, unquote. In fact, for him, Western education was the only key to future prosperity. This, Sayyid Ahmad thought, could be efficiently achieved through the translation of some of the most important books from English into Urdu to bring Western knowledge within the reach of people of India. Sayyid Ahmad Khan and his followers founded the Scientific Society on July 9th, 1864 at Ghazipur. The Scientific Society was established to provide a basis for mutual understanding and friendship between the British and the Muslims, unquote, and to familiarize the colonial government with the thoughts and grievances of the quote unquote natives. Besides that, Sayyid Ahmad Khan also wanted the society to serve as a conduit through which the much needed historical knowledge and learning could be shared and widely shared across the Muslim communities of India. He laid great emphasis on history and rise and fall of civilizations. He regretted the fact that Asian scholars never eliminated the birth and development of world civilizations in their works on history, but merely, quote unquote, chronicled the kings' ascension to power and their deaths. What he really wanted was a work that would analyze in detail specific character of nations, as well as their virtues and vices. So following that, he also set up two very important journals. First was the Aligarh Institute Gazette, which was an organ of the Scientific Society. And then this most influential journal, Tehzeeb-ul Akhlaq, also known as the Mohammedan Social Reformer in English. Sayyid Ahmad realized the absence of something fundamental in Muslim mind, which needed immediate attention and correction for his community to come out of that loss of power and depth and depression and for its future survival. So he looked for ways by which Indians, and not just Muslims, could overcome their mental enslavement. His embrace of Western secular learning, along with the adoption of English language, arguably was one of the most powerful models for Muslim education in 19th century India. True to his stature, he effectively channeled his radical imagination of freedom through education into a lasting enterprise. And, I'm grateful to Yasmin Saikia for her excellent bringing together of most recent work on him. And the moment of his embrace of reason and its consonance with faith can be clearly discerned in his own words. And I quote, "I concluded that faith cannot be without certainty, and certainty cannot be without knowledge. This certainty should be like the certainty about 10 being more than 3, so that its truth is enduring. Then I asked myself how reason can with certainty remain free from error. I admitted that such certainty is not really obtainable. Only if reason is used constantly can the error of the reason of one person be corrected by the reason of a second person, and the reasonings of one period by the reasonings of a second." Such was his belief in the need for constant re-examination of every aspect of tradition and even faith that, it of course went against the orthodox imagination of Islam in those times, and sadly as it still does in our times too. So coming to his educational reforms, as I mentioned earlier, he modeled the MAO college in Aligarh, which later became Aligarh Muslim University after Oxbridge. He envisioned an autonomous Muslim institution free from government funding. And, I quote him here, "As long as we depend on government for wants, which are essentially of a domestic nature, as education necessarily is, we really expect to get what is simply impossible to obtain. The best educational institutions in Europe are either entirely or next to entirely free from any control of the government," unquote. Sayyid Ahmad worked hard to remove suspicions from the minds of Muslims about learning of the English language. He gave the example of Hindus who were wise enough to learn the language of the rulers of the day so that they could prosper under the Mughal rule and later under the British. And he said, and I quote, "No religious prejudices interfere with our learning any language spoken by any of the many nations of the world. From remote antiquity have we studied Persian, and no prejudice has ever interfered with the study of that language. Why then," he asked, "should the prejudices enter in learning the English language now?" And this is why he made sure that, at the MA College in Aligarh and later the university were to address these concerns of the Muslim families that, their children would be taken away from religion. And thus he established a distinct English and Orient department in the college, and remember, this is the middle of 19th century. So, the terminology is of course telling. In the college, with a few subjects taught in one and the others in the Oriental department, and also making it, urging the Muslim students to observe prayers and fast during Ramzan. So this kind of whole approach towards education and learning English language, learning the streams of Western knowledge, was this project of Sayyid Ahmad Khan in embracing modernity. And Islam was perceived by him as being not against modernity. He sought a reinterpretation of the faith by employing tools of modern scientific research. The breaking of the continuous link with the past as a result of the massive socio-economic changes the world had undergone since the Industrial Revolution and had enabled new forms of religious authorities to emerge, made the way for the need for reformation. And this new authority necessarily had to have contours in the Enlightenment tradition, which Sayyid Ahmad Khan fully endorsed. It was a daunting task taken by many Muslim thinkers in the early 20th century, not just in South Asia, but in the Arab world as well. and they questioned the traditional authority of the orthodoxy and struggled to find relevance in a changing world. And that's why Sayyid Ahmad proposed not only ijtehad, which essentially, ijtihad is about making this intellectual effort to in the questions of faith, and broadly we can also term it as reinterpretation, or reaching a different application of the religious principle to the current times. And but not just that he was proposing ijtihad, but he was also arguing for a modern ilm-al-kalam, which is just a structure of knowledge. So in a speech delivered in Lahore in 1884, Sayyid Ahmad said, and I quote, "Today we are as before in need of modern ilm-al-kalam, by which we should either refute the doctrines of the modern sciences or undermine their foundations, or show that they are in conformity with the articles of Islamic faith," unquote. He felt that Muslims had lost their initiative due to the totalizing interpretation of Islam, and therefore he was trying to break away from this exclusive reliance on jurists and theologians of the past. So in that vein, he also rejected the principle of ijma, or consensus, consensus of the scholars, or the jurists and the theological sort of experts of theology in the classical sense, mainly because of that reason. And while convinced of the perfection of religion, the deen, and the finality of Prophet Muhammad, Sayyid Ahmad Khan did not accept the finality of the Sharia. The Sharia, according to him, was, I quote, an ongoing, and I quote this from Rodriguez, which is a very good summary in a nutshell of what he was arguing for the rejection of Sharia, was an ongoing and an evolving legal mechanism bound up with interpersonal, socio-political, and economic ways of life, unquote. Science, Sayyid Ahmad said, and I quote him, "shall be in our right hand, and philosophy in our left, and on our head shall be the crown of there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his apostle." He found, like his other successor or contemporary, Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, that if Quranic principles were adopted, there would remain no incompatibility between modern sciences and Islam. And that's why his commentaries of the Quran, Tafsirul Quran, which were published in a series over from 1880 to 1904, his approach towards the interpretation was extremely rational. He aimed to demonstrate that the Quran was not in conflict with the new arts and sciences, as Saikia concludes in the New Cambridge Companion to Sayyid. And he also tried to resolve the difficulties inherent in the four traditional sources of Muslim law by scrutinizing the classical data of hadith, or the sayings of the Prophet, and an almost unlimited emphasis on ijtihad, which he considered an inalienable right of every individual Muslim. Now, this is a really, radical idea, even today in many Muslim majority societies. It's difficult to make this argument. Celebrated historian Irfan Habib at Aligarh, in his paper Questionings Within Religious Thought, The Experience of Islam, tells us how Sayyid Ahmad argued that the word of God could not be in conflict with the work of God, quote unquote. Therefore, the Quran must be subjected to a constant process of reinterpretation as our scientific knowledge improves. The Quran and nature have little conflict between them, while the unchanging element in religiousness was the aspect of personal relation with God. In his various writings, he continued to argue that hadith, or the Prophet's reported statements, must be scrutinized, rationalized, and where they were in conflict with either the Quran or with reason, should be rejected. And he even argued that the supernatural events like miracles were no longer possible, and in fact were not possible even by all the religious figures of the past, that the Islamic tradition tells us. And so in that quest for a new criterion for scriptural interpretation, Sayyid Ahmad found a higher principle in nature, discovered by science through its own methods and representing, as I mentioned earlier, work of God, which could not stand in contradiction to the word of God. Again, the need for reinterpretation of the Quran. As a result of these radical ideas, Sayyid Ahmad, in the words of Shamim Akhtar's, and I cite from this paper, Evolution of Sayyid Ahmad Khan's Religious Thought, a note, he would be, I quote, standing on a ground where what appeared to others as a linguistically natural meaning of a Quranic verse became unnatural to him because it would then contradict our science-derived knowledge of nature, unquote. And Sayyid Ahmad's ideas, led to his opponents calling him a naturey and the followers of nature, and which was a contemptuous sort of a slur against his scholarship. Sayyid Ahmad also held that since the Quran was addressed to everyone, and therefore it should be internalized by everyone, and the Muslims were free to interpret for themselves what God required them to do. This is why he termed ijtehad, earlier I mentioned the process of applying religious principles to the modern day and intellectual struggle, ijtehad, as the inalienable right of every individual Muslim. I again emphasize this point. And therefore, he argued that all aspects of Muslim religious law should be reconsidered. The Quran, the Hadith, the Sharia should be discussed and debated. And the Quran should have commentaries with all different interpretations, and the members of Muslim community should be free to choose the interpretation which seems the most valid to them. And membership in the Muslim community or in a particular religious order should not depend on any one particular interpretation or commentary of the Holy Scripture. He named the ability to make logical deductions as a prerequisite before Islamic scholarship to become a mujtahid, as Al-Razi and Ghazali had done before him. And this point is, highlighted a lot by Sheila McDonough, who I'm really grateful for excellent chapter in a lovely book, most accessible, and in which she tells us that Sayyid held that there is, and I quote, "there is perhaps no religion upon earth superior to Islam in respect of the liberty of judgment which it grants in matters of religious faith," unquote. What Sayyid Ahmad aimed was, in fact, a rejection rather than a reinterpretation of the many elements of Muslim theology. In his journals that I mentioned earlier, where he regularly wrote, he opposed polygamy and said the modern world did not need it anymore. Just as slavery was abolished once, so too could polygamy be abolished, he reasoned. He also opposed a number of Islamic penalties like cutting of hand and stoning. He even went as far as to make allowances for charging interest on money lent to the affluent people. In all these injunctions and their application, he maintained discussion and dialogue to be of utmost importance. Sayyid Ahmad also held, and I think that this is again very important, that jihad was not incumbent on Muslims as long as the society or the regime they were living under allowed them religious freedoms. And he went further and asserted that among the many wars fought in the name of religion over the centuries by Muslims, very few could be called jihad. The wars of the first century in Islam's history were necessary due to self-defense, the imperative of self-defense, so they were duly termed as jihad. But wars motivated by political disputes, in which he included the 1857 revolt, did not concern religion. He was very particular about the idea that it would be a grave mistake to identify one's political purposes with the will of God. In his own words, and I quote, and is again from Sheila McDonough. So it should be borne in mind that the wars of the present day cannot be taken as wars of religions or crusades, because they are not undertaken with religious motives, but they are entirely based upon political matters and have nothing to do with Islamic or religious wars. Sayyid Ahmad wished to shape the Islam of his times and the future, and but his bold vision of this reformism faced immense challenges. There was a strong resistance to his ideas from several quarters. Many Muslim clerics denounced him as a heretic, an apostate, or even an atheist. He was abused as a naturey, as I talked about before, and was fiercely attacked for his attempts on reinterpreting the Quran. So his contemporary Jamaluddin Afghani wrote an essay, entitled "The Materialists of India," in which he strongly condemned Sayyid Ahmad in the following words. I quote: "He appeared in the guise of naturalists or materialists and proclaimed that nothing exists but blind nature, and that all the prophets were naturalists. Sayyid Ahmad's rejection of the miracle of the night journey to the heavens, or the Miraj, was particularly infamous among his religious contemporaries." So Sayyid Ahmad had to face strong opposition from even his close relatives and colleagues. So Mushir Hassan, this great historian of India who recently passed away, notes in one of his papers that Sayyid Ahmad, one of his aunts, refused to see him on account of taking, I quote, "too kindly to the culture of the foreigner and the infidel," unquote. In Aligarh itself, as documented by many others, that his successors and supporters like Nawab Mohsinul Mulk and others allowed these ideas to be quietly sidelined. And despite that, he still remains a target of vehement criticism even today. Religious scholars in South Asia have tried to pick up inconsistencies in his arguments, his philosophy, and while Sayyid's endorsement and his closeness to the West have equally been a cause of strong worded critiques and sometimes even abuse from anti-colonialists. I will now turn to his emphasis on akhlaq, or ethics, higher ethics, and he placed a high value on the trustworthiness of the Muslim conscience. The function of religion to him was the inculcation of values of justice and mercy that would lead to the formation of sensitive consciences in individuals. This was the essence, in his view, of Muslim heritage. Religion, therefore, as noted in the Cambridge Companion to Sayyid Ahmad, 2019, was about love and service to humanity and not a hurdle to progress. He beseeched the Muslims to embark on the path of a transformed and modern outlook towards faith. And for him, religion was only a set of beliefs, not an institution for political conflict. To him, as the editors of the Cambridge Companion note, religion for political gains would have been bigotry. He believed that ethical thinking was a powerful instrument of social change. And therefore, akhlaq was the centrality of akhlaq. And, also I would draw your attention to the earlier journal I mentioned, one of the major journals, Tehzeebul Akhlaq, was the training of individuals to relate in a constructive way to other individuals. So it was this part of this training which would lead to social harmony. And therefore, it had to involve active effort to achieve good relations with all communities, including the non-Muslims as well. And this is why Sayyid Ahmad Khan, stressed participatory action, and that he viewed that the state was not the main agent in implementing reform. Instead, he emphasized self-help as being a basic virtue, and therefore voluntary associations, in his view, were very important. And that's why he continued, as I've already mentioned, from 1860s or even he continues to create these networks, these societies, these journals, schools, colleges, and now in popular parlance that is known as Aligarh Movement. And so it was his idea of voluntary association and engaging the Muslim communities and the non-Muslims in this akhlaq of dealing with each other. It was so central to his ideas of social reform. And if I were to quote the historian K. Nizami, who opined that his approach to reform was twofold, I quote, and this is from the Cambridge Companion, was persuading people to abandon their old habits and customs, which impeded their social advancement, and encouraging them to take up the new scientific and rational approach, unquote. And therefore, Sayyid Ahmad's approach towards education was also a potential site for friendship, quote unquote. And this is why he laid special emphasis on creating understanding between communities through dialogue and accommodation. And tolerance was not just a passive notion. It was, in his view, a goal to be achieved through much effort, through almost like ijtehad and discerned and consistent effort. So the discussion with a goal to arrive at common agreements through persuasion and mutual respect was of utmost importance in his entire work and practice. And this is why I this radical reimagination of the community was certainly far ahead of its times. I'll quickly talk a bit about the Muslim question in South Asia, which remains a problem even today, problem or an issue, and still is being explored and debated upon. And again, in the Cambridge Companion to Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Yasmin Saikia, and M. Raisur Rahman, they argue, and I quote, the modern project that Sayyid Ahmad inaugurated for Muslims was not an effort to become British-like. He advocated it as a capacity to change. Thus, he remained committed to Indian heritage and history, while simultaneously calling for change to adapt to current times, unquote. And this is why his focus in many of the writings was on this blend, this hybrid Hindustani identity. And I quote again him, there's a quote from him, by the word Qaum, I mean both Hindus and Muslims. In my opinion, and Qaum is just to remind community, even it's sometimes translated as nation, and that's why it's used as a nation, but the idea of nation in the Pakistan movement later. By the word Qaum, I mean both Hindus and Muslims. In my opinion, it matters not whatever be their religious belief, because we cannot see anything of it. But what we see is that all of us, whether Hindus or Muslims, live on one soil, are governed by one and the same ruler, have the same sources of benefits, and equally share the hardships of famine, unquote. And his association and very close friendships with Hindus can be easily noted from his public acknowledgement, like at the occasion of his grandson's Rasme Bismillah, where he committed to an inclusive idea of the community. And so I quote here, and he's addressing his Hindu friend who is there to attend this important ceremony of Bismillah, which is like a traditional occasion when children start their learning of the Holy Quran. I quote, my clean-shaven friend Das is here, and my grandson is sitting beside him. He's my friend and brother. Sayyid Mahmud, Sir Sayyid's son, calls him uncle, while he is Dada Raja to my grandson Ross Masood, unquote. True to his commitment in encouraging respect and friendship between Hindus and Muslims, Sayyid Ahmad would oppose cow slaughter even before violence in the name of cow vigilantism erupted between the two communities. He counseled Muslims to sacrifice goats and sheep on Eid al-Adha and not hurt the sentiments of Hindus by slaughtering cows. And it is a well-recorded fact that the first graduate from Aligarh Muslim University was Ishwari Prasad, a Hindu. And for many years, since its inception, the number of Hindu students outnumbered that of Muslim students. All the same, he identified himself as a Musalman-e-Hind, Muslim of India, and therefore offered concrete thinking of for the improvement of the Muslim condition in India. And so, he was this major figure who was straddling the Indianness and Muslimness without a major conflict or even a paradox. And today in the 21st century, we find that this whole revisionism of history in India, and Pakistan has already been there through that moment. Creates this conflict and this divergence. And look at this this man, talking about this inclusive identities and the idea of a community and the idea of community action. So, what is the legacy of Sayyid Ahmad Khan? I mean, that's my final part. The Aligarh movement that he inspired resonated across India and left deep, imprint on the history of modern India. The alumni of MAO College and later Aligarh Muslim University had a very central role in the independence movement in India. Sayyid Ahmad generated the consciousness among Indians about their rights. Modern educated Muslims that were graduating from Aligarh Muslim University asserted their demand for political rights, both in the early 20th century and later many of them were part of the Pakistan movement. And both Indian National Congress and Muslim League, these two forces of the early 20th century, India carried the legacy of the Aligarh Muslim University in their ranks, And the alumni of Aligarh Muslim University, or ALIGS, as they spread out in the world, carrying this message of empowerment through education. And, and I'll quote again this amazing mission statement of sorts in Sayyid Ahmad's own words. I quote, "To go throughout the length and breadth of the land to preach the message of free inquiry, large-hearted toleration, and pure morality that is possible only with modern education," unquote. So the effects of his movement and his efforts are such that they can be seen everywhere, and is there, and that legacy lives on because that quest hasn't really ended. If I once again quote the historian K.A. Nizami, again a very profound sentence, and I quote, "He thus became a social and moral force which accelerated the processes of transition from the medieval to the modern age," unquote. So Sayyid Ahmad's public life was marked by thinking and acting ahead of his times. Even in his quest to reform Muslims, he displayed no bias towards non-Muslims, and perhaps this is why his profound work defies the nation states of India and Pakistan. In a way, this opens up the possibilities of removing him from the geographies of India and Pakistan and reverting to the geography of knowledge that he was laying out in the latter part of the 19th century. The Muslim tradition considers tariq or sequential history as a vital driver of enlightenment, and a lot of Sayyid's work and his writings and the work that he encouraged others to do was an exploration of that. And to use this, Aristotle's idea of seeing the light in the darkest of moments, Sayyid Ahmad remains a beacon that provides a guide to Muslim cultures across the globe to employ ideas from religion and cultures as instruments of transformation instead of being trapped by them. So Sayyid Ahmad's focus on education, reform, and blending tradition with modernity therefore remains as important today as it was nearly 2 centuries ago. And I would end here. And Okay, and I think we are joined by Mr. Masood. Thank you so much for being here.
Raza, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for your excellent biography and especially the legacy that you concluded with. As somewhat related to Sir Sayyid, he was one of my ancestors. My short form, I say he was my grandfather's grandfather, so he was my great grandfather. What I would just like to re-emphasize, without adding, I don't think anything you've said needs to be added to, but just as a re-emphasizing and perhaps pointing one aspect of Sir Sayyid, hopefully you will agree, that despite his constant strife for a more rational, more secular, more harmonious approach to faith, and very correctly, as you said, separating it from political discourse. I think the most important quote that you shared this evening was where he said, "The word of God must not be in contradiction with, or be seen in contradiction with, the work of God." And that says so much about the way Sir Sayyid thought about these issues. And I just, I can't emphasize that enough. But also keeping in view that he was from a fairly devout family, and he remained quite devout in a very broad sense, not in a narrow religious sense, but in a broad sense. And at the same time with being devout, he was a fighter for this kind of harmonious and almost secular approach, and never kowtowed, even though you rightly mentioned that his first job was as a munshi of the East India Company, of course, and he had to fall in line there, but he rose out of that, and he never allowed himself or his companions, whether Hindu, Muslim, or indeed even British. He had some very close British friends, even though he wasn't very conversant in English. His son, Justice Sayyid Mahmood, helped him in his discourse when he was living in London for 2 years in the late 1860s. But he was always focused on the right of let's call them the natives for ease, to stand up for themselves and not to be kowtowed. So respect for the colonial masters, which he certainly had in many ways, never translated into considering himself or his race or his community as being subservient. In fact, there was a very famous incident where he walked out of a viceroy's conference because when the seating arrangement was that the viceroy and his staff were sitting at a level above the Indians, the Hindustanis, including the Muslims, and he just stood up and walked out and said, "I refuse to be part of this." So, and during the mutiny, he in fact, and this is a kind of a converse to what I've just said, in the mutiny, his house, as you rightly said, was raided and attacked and his possessions were taken. But he safeguarded a number of British families inside his house and stood on the doorstep and said, "You will attack them over my dead body." So he had all of these, and he had that respect amongst the community that it was enough for them not to proceed any further. So in many ways, I just wanted to emphasize some of the things that you said, and I would just finish by saying you were so right that his ideas and his thoughts have sort of been completely sort of Pakistanized in a sense, as you said, and he's now seen as the sort of the originator of the movement for Pakistan. He wasn't. If he had survived, he may well have been, but it would have been a very different interpretation. Right. It would have been a very different emphasis on what Pakistan should stand for, and the secular nature of the country, which indeed persons like Jinnah and the like were very much a part of. So I think it's a great shame that his real kind of beliefs have been so watered down in the Pakistan education system, and that he is seen as one of the earliest sort of proponents of a separate nation. He may well have been it, but it would have been a very different struggle, a very different movement. So again, thank you very much for the talk. Most enjoyable.
So thank you so much for being here. I'm really honored and delighted, you know. But I just quickly want to respond to what you earlier said, and I mean, and that's the last comment, Eric. I know we are out of time almost. Is that, you know, so this image of a man wearing a suit, a black English suit with a free long beard and a fez cap, you know. So I mean, so that sums it up, you know. So there's this religion, tradition, modernity, and this view towards future. I mean, you know, so if you look at many of the other photos which I could not really have access to, so they all tell us about even his visual sort of iconography at that time says a lot about what he was arguing and proposing. And you're absolutely right. We don't know whether he may very well have been the project, you know, founder or supporter of Pakistan, but we don't know that. You know, it's a postulate. And the reality is he's as important to India as to Pakistan today. And that's the unfortunate part in the Indian public consciousness, in public memory, in popular culture. He's barely mentioned, you know, in cinema or in magazines. I mean, there's an occasional article or two which appear, you know, on his perfunctory sort of analysis. And here's this guy who was engaging with all communities, you know, at that particular time. So thank you so much again.
Thank you to all of you. This was really an excellent discussion and a fantastic presentation, Raza. Thank you so much for